Our second speaker this afternoon is William Rydell, Stanford University. His field was plasma physics, studying with advisor Mark Capelli, and he did his residencies at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 2019 and 2020. Will, take over.
Can you all hear me? Cool. All right, well, thank you for the introduction. So I'll just jump right in. Plasmas collide sometimes. Specifically, what we're interested in is when unmagnetized, fully ionized plasmas collide. So sometimes these can occur in nature, and these are something we can also reproduce in the lab using high-energy lasers like you see at Omega and NIF. The behavior of these collisions depends very closely on sort of the collisional mean free path of the plasma. So by that I mean just the average distance that some particle in the plasma will travel before it undergoes a collision. Sometimes these jets are highly collisional, sometimes they're collisionless, and sometimes it's intermediate, somewhere in between. The specific experiment that we're going to look at is we're going to be running something called inverted corona targets on these laser facilities. So specifically what I'll be showing is Omega stuff. So an inverted corona target consists of a hollow plastic sphere, usually with a deuterated liner on the interior surface, that can either be hollow in vacuum or with a low-density gas fill with one or more laser entrance holes. The way these work is, the reason they're called inverted, is the laser passes through the inside of these laser entrance holes, illuminates the interior surface of these targets. That generates this plasma, which ejects these plasma jets coming off the wall. These are going to converge towards the target center, moving very quickly, and then they're going to collide and stagnate, generating a hot, dense plasma. So you can kind of think of it as a Hall-ROM, except if the fuel of the Hall-ROM was lined along the outside there. These types of targets have some interest for a novel neutron source, and the reason being is because they're very insensitive to illumination asymmetry. You can actually run these with single-sided illumination with essentially no degradation in your yield. So that gives you some flexibility in terms of how you might design sort of radiography experiments. But they're also interesting from a perspective of just understanding kinetic physics, and so that's kind of what we're going to look at a little bit more here. What we'd like to do is model these systems and simulate them and sort of understand a little bit more how they work. So typically, inertially confined plasmas are modeled using the fluid approximation. So imagine if you're zoomed in on some small region of plasma in a system that you're trying to model. There's a bunch of particles, and they're all located in space, and they're all located at some velocity, so at some point in velocity space as well as physical space. So you can describe this plasma using something called a velocity distribution function, where it basically just describes the number of particles that you see at any sort of moving with any sort of velocity. Many particles moving here, but very few particles moving some at random velocity to the left. In principle, these VDFs can be anything, but in general, they're typically converged to a well-known function. So the fluid assumption is that if this collisional mean free path is very, very short, then on very rapid timescales, the plasmas in some local region will collide rapidly and exchange energies, and they'll sort of converge to a Maxwellian distribution. The nice thing about Maxwellian is you can describe it with basically three parameters. You can have the density, the average velocity of that distribution, and then some thermal width, which is just your temperature, sort of the average random kinetic energy. So it's a really powerful way to do simulations, and it's often a good assumption, but that's not always the case. For example, this is a preliminary fluid simulation of an inverted corona target. So this is kind of the cross-section. You can kind of see this is the top half. Where's the plat? So this is sort of the outer shell. The lasers are coming through the center, and you're getting this jet that's coming off that's going to stagnate on the center axis there. So using density and velocity data from these fluid simulations, you can basically come up with an estimate of what the mean free path is at everywhere in the plasma. And you can see that as you have this sort of jet coming off, at the very tip of this jet, you have very fast, low-density plasma that's moving in, and you get this mean free path that's much, much larger than the scale length of the target itself. So this is inconsistent with this fluid assumption, so it's inconsistent. What are the consequences of that? Well, in a fluid plasma, when these things finally collide, what would happen is the moment you get two jets coming in at either directions, they're going to collide instantaneously. They're going to take all of that directed kinetic energy and convert it in sort of random thermal energy, and you're going to get sort of one uniform high-temperature plasma right at the center. In reality, though, if you have this long mean free path, what you might expect is that these plasmas are actually going to pass through each other before they stagnate, which will sort of change the structure of stagnation and lead to sort of mixing and other effects like that. So instead of running fluids, we are going to take a kinetic approach to modeling these systems, specifically the particle and cell technique. So in a PIC, instead of assuming Maxwellian, you basically treat the plasma as a collection of macro particles that sample the velocity distribution. This allows you to basically sample arbitrary velocity distributions as long as you have sort of enough statistics in your system. Specifically, we're going to be using a particular code. It's a hybrid particle and cell code called Chicago. This allows us to treat the ions kinetically, but maintaining the electrons as a massless fluid, which means we get to capture sort of the ion kinetics, but at a reduced computational cost compared to a full PIC simulation. The nice thing about Chicago is it also includes a laser ray tracing package and a binary fusion algorithm, so we can really run an entire simulation of this experiment all in one go. So it's really nice. And because we're looking at sort of these primary 1D kinetic mix mechanisms, we're going to be focusing on 1D, although I'm going to touch a little bit on 2D simulations at the end. OK, so simulations will be nice, but what can we actually compare them to in experiments? Plasmas are obviously notoriously difficult to probe, but one of the nice things about having a fusion scale plasma is actually you can use fusion products as a diagnostic. Certain colliding atoms, specifically in this case deuterium, if they collide with each other, there's a chance that they will undergo a fusion reaction, producing a helium ion and a neutron. The neutrons are uncharged, so they'll basically escape the system without being perturbed significantly, and you can pick them up and measure them, and that'll give you information about what's going on in the system. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we use that when I describe the specific experiment. So today what I'm going to focus on is sort of gas-filled inverted corona targets. So these work basically the same, except you tack on some windows and then you fill this plasma with a target with a low-density gas. So this way, when you get this plasma blow-off, instead of expanding in a vacuum, you're sort of pushing against and compressing this low-density gas. And you might ask, why are we interested in that? Well, two reasons. One, if you're interested in these as a neutron source, adding a fill gas will increase your yield. And secondly, this actually has some sort of connection to sort of mainline indirect derived fusion. So here's just a cartoon of an indirect derived source. NIF's going well these days. Big shot in August. Everyone's excited about it. Basically, what we're showing here is you have this gold Hall ROM, and the lasers are going to be coming in, hitting the interior surface of this gold Hall ROM. It's going to generate X-rays, which eventually push down on this fuel capsule. It is important to balance sort of the inner beam and outer beams here so that you get even and symmetric compression of this target. And so that's what you're trying to do. But what happens is you're going to get plasma blow-off from this Hall ROM and also from the compressed target. And that plasma can actually enter the beam path and sort of mess with propagation. So it can kind of throw off your balance. To minimize that, NIF uses a low-density helium gas fill, about 0.3 milligrams per cc, to try and sort of tamp that expansion and minimize that interaction. But this is the kind of thing that we'd like to make sure we understand very well in order to see what's going on. But so back to the inverted corona target specifically. The experiments we're going to run, we're going to be doing them at Omega. And we're going to run targets where we have deuterium gas fills of various fill densities. Increasing the fill density allows you to basically decrease the mean free path and vice versa, so you can get a good control of it. And so it's going to be deuterium gas every time, except we're going to run 2 experiments at every pressure. One where the shell is non-reactive CH plastic, and another where the shell is purely reactive CD plastic. So what's going to happen is when this sort of compression happens, some amount of shell material is going to mix into that gas and reach that hotspot while stagnation occurs. If that shell material is deuterium, it's going to contribute to that neutron yield. But if it's non-reactive hydrogen, it won't. So by comparing the total yield of the 2 targets, you're going to get sort of a measure of sort of the amount of mix that's occurring in this system. And that's what we're going to look at. So we ran a bunch of these simulations. And these are some sort of these are some results just showing the overall evolution of the system. So what we're showing here are density contours for different species for 2 different experiments. So the top row here is going to be a low density, 0.17 milligrams per cc gas fill. And the bottom row is going to be a high density CD fill, so one that's more collisional. Each plot is going to be basically sort of a density contour in time. So time along the x-axis, y is the radius. So if you look at the density case, if you look at the gas species in the low density case here, just to start, you can see that at T equals 0, you have some uniform gas fill all the way out to the radius of the shell. But as you move to the right, you march forward in time, this gas gets compressed before it stagnates at the center. So these black contour lines here show where most of the neutron yield is being generated. There's a lot of structure and stuff that's interesting here, but just the important thing to focus on is you can see that if you compare this plot to the shell material plots on the right, you can see that there's a significant region of overlap where there's a significant amount of both shell material and gas material. You can quantify that a little bit more explicitly by basically just plotting the contours of where the plasma is 90% gas and 10% gas by molar density. So you can see where there is a significant amount of mix. And what you see in these targets is that at that low density case, you get a huge mix region that makes it immediately to the stagnation point. And basically everywhere you have yield, you are having significant shell mix. So that's significantly going to affect sort of what's going on in your target. Alternatively, when you increase the mean free path, increase that density, this mixed region is going to be much smaller. It's never going to make it to the axis. And it's actually only going to reach this stagnation sort of hotspot, kind of hotspot, towards the end after most of the fusion yield has already been produced. So you can see just very obviously there's like a very significant amount of difference in mix that you can control by controlling this fill pressure. So we'd like to look at this in phase space, just get more of an intuition for actually what's going on in the plasma in a more detailed picture. So the way we're going to do that is what's called a phase space diagram. So just a quick aside here. These are nice little plots that you can run in kinetic simulations. So the way it works is x is position and y is going to be velocity. And it plots all the points in the plasma at their position in phase space, so what their velocity is and what their position is. And the easiest way to think about it is at any given point in space, if you take a vertical line out of that plasma, this line out gives you the velocity distribution at that region. So this is just a toy example of a uniform plasma that's 500 eV moving at 500 kilometers per second to the left. So you can see anywhere you would take this line out, you get the same velocity distribution here. Just sort of as an intuition, sort of the density, the intensity of this contour is going to give you the density. The y position of sort of where this beam is going to give you that average velocity, and then sort of the width here is going to give you that temperature. Just a slightly more complicated, you can imagine having some 1D collisional shock, where in this case you now stagnate against the wall, and you have some stationary plasma that's wider here, so higher temperature. And so you can see that at different points in space, you have different plasmas. But if you take VDFs at either side, you can see that individually they're both still well modeled by Maxwellian. So this is something you can definitely do in a fluid simulation. On the other hand, if you look and go back to our inverted corona targets, you're going to see that we're getting very, very non-Maxwellian interactions at the gas shell interface. So again, this is sort of the same arrangement of plots with the low density case on top and the high density case on bottom. The gas is going to be on the left here, and these are the two shell species. To get a sense of what's going on, so radius is on the left. So at the top right here, this is where the cold, dense shell is originating. It's like slowly getting pushed back, where this is sort of the V equals 0 position here. Everything else here is that plasma blow-off, which is accelerating and moving very rapidly inward towards the center of the target here. And the other thing to notice is these white dashed lines here are going to, they just measure sort of the, they mark the edges of the mixed region at this point in time. And what you can see is that this shell material is basically passing straight into this mixed region, passing through this gas without being significantly perturbed, without being stopped by it. And that's why you get this wide region, which is kind of interesting. But then more interesting is if you actually look at the gas, you can see that the gas material that was originally sort of at near where the shell is has been turned around, is accelerating right along with that incoming shell jet. And in fact, it's sort of counterstreaming and propagating against other gas particles that haven't yet been perturbed. So if you took a VDF sort of right along this curve here, you'd see two separate populations of gas particles counterstreaming against each other. So that's really interesting. And I won't go into details here, but what's actually happening here is all the particles are being accelerated by what's a weakly collisional electrostatic shock. So you can have collisionless shocks. And in the case of sort of a fully collisionless electrostatic shock, what happens is the electrons will expand from a high-density region into a low-density region, but they're going to leave behind those ions, and that's going to generate a large magnetic field. So that large electric field. And that electric field is just going to push on all particles equally and accelerate everything within that region so it passes through and sort of reflects the particles incoming against it. In our case, we're not fully collisionless, and by tuning this pressure, we can actually sort of moderate this mixed region and mediate sort of that collisionless shock. So we're kind of in this interesting intermediate regime. So that's nice, but the question is, when we actually compare this to experimental data, how well does it explain what's going on? And the answer is it seems, with limited data, it seems to do pretty well. So one more big plot here. This is gas fill density. So it's neutron yield is a function of gas fill density for both CH and CD targets for 3 cases. So in green is going to be fluid simulations. In blue is going to be kinetic simulations. And red is actual experimental data at omega. So it's not as perfect as it looks, because these are 1D simulations, so they're going to be over-predicting absolute yield. That's very common. So what we did is we just scaled down all of the we scaled down all the simulation data by constant factor just to match these 2 points right here. This way we can kind of see that relative scaling with pressure and see how well we're explaining it. So to start, I will compare the CD-CH targets for the fluid simulations. And you can see that there's a very shallow scaling as you increase pressure, which is basically the same for both CH and CD targets. The reasons for this is, in this single fluid case, there's no mix, so basically all yield, most of the yield is coming from that interior gas, and sort of the shell doesn't matter so much. And in the kinetic case for CD targets, the behavior is fairly similar. The difference is when you look at the CH targets for a kinetic simulation, as you go down in pressure, you're going to get increased mix. But that mix is not going to contribute to the yield, and so you're kind of going to dilute the hotspot. And you can see that you're going to have a much sharper drop-off in yield as you go down to low pressure. And the nice point is, when you compare with experimental data, you can see that we're capturing this sort of sharp drop-off in CH targets very well, and we're also capturing sort of the relative yield between a CD and CH target. So that's nice. It sort of confirms that there's a lot of mix going on in these targets, and suggests that these kind of 1D kinetic effects could basically, at least be sufficient to explain what's going on. And that's pretty cool, because these are pretty simple 1D simulations. So I don't know exactly how much time I have left, but I'm just also going to touch on what we've been doing recently, which is, seeing if there's anything that can be explained by expanding these simulations to 2D. So this is a lot of plots, and I'll try and go through, try and just simplify it down. But basically, these are density plots at certain points in time for a target now that is run in 2D with one side with 2 windows, and on the other side with a single window. So now instead of this hypothetical perfect sphere, you can kind of see the shape effect and see if compression along the windows is different than compressions up and down. And so on the top here is deuterium. Here we're plotting deuterium both in the shell and in the target. In the shell and in the gas. And so you see it starts at uniform, then you get some compression before you get sort of this stagnated hotspot region here. And you get the same here for a target with actually only 1 window. And just the gist of this slide is basically that despite the change in shape, you still get a fairly round, symmetric sort of hotspot that isn't really affected by the fact of whether you're running with 1 or 2 LEHs. And in fact, the simulated yield for these is essentially identical, and that's what we see experimentally too. So that's kind of nice to confirm. We also get a little bit more experimental data that we can compare to. So in this case, we're looking at X-ray emission images of the 2 types of targets at certain points in time, sort of later in the interaction. So in this case, we're looking at vacuum targets just because they don't have the fill tube that messes with these images. With our simulations, we can take the densities and temperatures and come up with synthetic X-ray emission images and compare them to what we see in experiments. And it actually seems like we are matching them quite nicely, which this isn't really so much a quantitative effect. This doesn't really match to any particular density or anything like that. But it sort of qualitatively shows that we are sort of capturing roughly what's going on in these systems pretty well. So that's nice. And then the last thing we wanted to check is if we're still reproducing this yield scaling in 2D. So when you run to 2D simulations, you actually do drop the yield a little bit, and you get it closer to what you see in experimental data. But we're still over-predicting by a little bit. Still by a factor of 3, which is trying to figure out. But if you, again, sort of normalize to this point in time, you can see that there's very little difference in sort of that yield scale trending, that yield trend scaling. So it seems that this sort of 2D shape effects don't have a really dramatic effect on anything going on with this target. So just to kind of summarize, I kind of rushed through it, I think. The gist is that in certain regimes of ICF, the fluid approximation can break down. These consequences you can be observed experimentally in certain conditions, and that kinetic ion simulations can predict this observed behavior better than fluid simulations can. Before I go, I would just like to acknowledge my Stanford advisor, Mark Capelli, my Livermore mentor, Nathan Mizan, my collaborators, and the LRGF. Honestly, without all of Mark, Nathan, and the LRGF, I probably wouldn't have made it to this point. So thank you very much. And I'll take any questions.